Bring in Spasimir Domaradzki. He's a researcher and lecturer at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw. Spasimir, thanks for your patience. I know that we had you waiting for a little bit when we had to cut to that NATO talk. There have been a lot of negotiations over the past weeks in terms of establishing these safe corridors to get this much-needed Ukrainian grain out from the Black Sea ports. The fact is that there's been little progress. And we know that there's a sense of urgency because the summer harvest season is just around the corner. What happens if this is not addressed properly?
Well, I have to admit that the real problem is when it comes to the question of this food crisis, that this is a part of the, I would say, Putin's strategy to make the world accepting his reshaping of the global order. And the food crisis is in its essence. What he wants to achieve is going to exert pressure that will ultimately come back as a boomerang to the European Union, to the West, which will face another enormous wave of migrants who will in search for, well, apparently basic needs as food, and the famine will spill over through the developing countries, and the implications will be visible for the whole world. It's amazing how I would say brutal is his vision of achieving his goals. I would say this is an open blackmail towards the whole world, because the paradox is that despite the arguments that it is Ukraine's guilt, it is actually Russia who blocks the Black Sea. We should have in mind the enormous efforts of the Turkish authorities to find a solution, which apparently seems also to be a part of Putin's vision, that he can play different players across the world to show that he, on one hand, kind of, I would say, pretends his willingness to make any concessions, but in practical terms, it is a very, I would say, rational from his perspective aim to make a global food crisis.
Spasimir, I mean, you say this is all part of the Russian president's strategy. I understand that, but there's another side to this equation, and let me bring this out. I want to ask you if the West should assume some responsibility when it comes to this current crisis, because it is because of their sanctions imposed on Russia. Russian grains cannot get out. Russian fertilizer cannot get out. This is also an angle to be discussed as well.
Yeah, well, following that logic, I would just make one step further and just argue that the sanctions are because someone has violated the basic principles of international law. And actually, applying the sanctions is the least the West can do in order to express its dissatisfaction with what Putin is doing. I agree with you. The implications of that are very serious, but let's also see the things in their full picture. The West tries to do as much as it is possible, and here the word West, I think, is a bit of a simplification, but there is no doubt that in particular the countries from Central Europe, including Poland, Romania, but also other European countries, try to aid as much as they can to find alternative routes for the Ukrainian wheat and grain. And in that sense, it will extend the logistics, the supply chains, but undoubtedly these are efforts that try to resolve the problem. Undoubtedly, there is no better way than to unblock the Black Sea, and this is what the Russians simply don't want. So it is easy to claim that the blame is because there are sanctions, but the sanctions are not because the West simply wants to block Russia, but because Russia did things that are simply unacceptable.
Okay, Spasimir, since I have you on, I do have to ask you, because your research concentrates on European integration as well as enlargement policy. I want to ask you if there is a risk for the European Union to be seen as given perhaps preferential treatment for Ukraine during their membership process, which I think you would agree could be misunderstood by other candidate countries, potentially even pushing them closer to Russia.
You're absolutely correct. I think it is easy to notice that there are certain signals already, including the attitude of Serbian President Vucic, who declared today that he, prior to his decision whether he will go to Brussels, said that he needs to meet the prime ministers and president of Albania and prime minister of North Macedonia in order to make a decision, and then to meet his government. So technically, there is an issue. There is a certain level of frustration among the countries that are already for a long period in the waiting room, and they are really concerned that something that was previously obvious, that there is an enlargement path and there is a European neighborhood policy, are now going to be merged as a consequence of the war with Russia. And in that respect, yes, there is a serious issue, and it demands a very sound position from the European Union, which will not discourage the countries from the Western Balkans, which are already for a long period of time in the waiting room.
All right, Spasimir Domaradzki, thank you very much for joining us here on TRT World. Thanks for your
Thank you
patience. I
very
do
much for
appreciate the
having me.
analysis.